This is an international podcast transmission. Is anyone out there? If you're listening, you've reached the No Fixed Agenda podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of No Fixed Agenda, brought to you by Bubs Natural. You have your host here, or co-host, Omar.
And Jeff. Yes,
we're trying to be serious right now. Doesn't work too well.
No.
But today, my good sir, we have Mike Grove.
Yeah, another education conversation.
Yes.
Which this is the second of three conversations we had. And this conversation was really cool because it was from an administrative aspect.
Yeah, high level.
And it took a different direction than when we our first conversation with Laura and being an elementary school teacher and stuff. So it was really kind of cool to hear from an administrative aspect and what the mentality is at the schools and how they approach some of the education aspects of it. So it was really fun to talk to Mike and hear that. And he's a lot of history with it.
Oh, dude, he was very, very background oriented on it. And you can tell he's been in education for quite some time, and he drops a lot of knowledge in regards to what happens behind the scene at a high level, and he even dropped what he thought about the educational system. I think it's a good thing that he was retired.
Yeah,
because he could.
What I loved is
speak freely.
Yes, he could speak freely, but what you could tell he was an educator.
Yeah.
Because he came in with his long list of bullet points that he wanted to talk about, or questions he thought we were going to ask, or whatever it was. But I was like,
he came prepared.
It
wasn't like all our other episodes where people were just like, let's wing it. It's called No Fixed Agenda for a reason, yo.
And I love that about Mike. It was awesome. I don't know if we touched on any of his bullet points that
I think we did.
Maybe we did.
Yeah.
I think we touched on a lot of really good things, and it was just like, again, really cool to hear that side of things with it. So again, we try and keep it as light and casual as possible when it comes to it. We try not to. We don't want to bash any education system or any school districts. State, whatever it is, like we're trying to keep it as casual as possible. It's the facts that he knows and what he has seen over the years,
over 30 plus years
of his education background. So, take it for what it is. I think it's just a very educated conversation and kind of puts a little bit of insight on some of that stuff. So
it made me think about the whole educational system. It made me think about some of the ways he brought up, like, hey, dude, school isn't meant for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think that resonated with me, and I think it's going to resonate with a lot of the audience and going, yeah, you know what? That's why school sucked for me.
Yeah.
And not because you suck, but because it wasn't designed for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the big points you brought home, and it was really cool. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this conversation. It was fun, and we had the conversation with Mike after our interview with him, and I don't want to give any spoilers out because we haven't set that aside. But if his next conversation with us comes together, that's going to be a really cool one.
Dude,
again, I'm just going to leave a little cliffhanger there.
Hey, trust me when I tell you, it is a life-changing conversation.
But we have to make that happen first.
Yes,
but there's interest from both sides, and I think if that conversation comes together, I think it's going to be a really cool one. But for now, education from the administrative aspect. Let's just get right into it. Here we go, guys. The No Fixed Agenda podcast is brought to you by Bubs Naturals. Their mission is simple: live better, longer. Bubs helps fuel people to reach their maximum human potential through supplements sourced from nature's highest quality ingredients, all by giving 10% of profits back to charity. That's right, people. 10% back to charity. Learn more about their NSF for Sport certified collagen peptides and electrolyte drink mix at bubsnaturals.com.
First and foremost, thank you for coming on. Yep. What we like to do on No Fixed Agenda is give us who you are.
All right.
What's your background? And we like to call it your business Tinder profile. So
I think it's more or less, I just want to see people's expression when they hear that and kind of realize in their visual whether they know how Tinder works or not. And I will state right now, I think 100% of the people that have been on that we've asked
don't know.
Know it,
but don't know how it works.
But don't really know how it works or have never actually been on it. Yeah. I think that's what makes it ironic, the fact that we ask people that.
Even though your interviewees don't have any idea what it is.
The question is, have you been on Tinder?
Never been on Tinder. So
no, but okay.
Your winning streak.
Your winning streak. 100. We're batting 1,000 over here, baby. Yes. All right.
That's all that matters.
But when you said your Tinder profile, I immediately got a heart on.
Fair enough.
Fair.
From what I hear about it.
From my understanding.
Exactly.
Anyways, give us
I'd
your...
be really bad at it because I thought it was left for you.
So I will say we've already lost one listener because his daughter is now not listening anymore. She's turned this off already.
Natalia was like, what? Mike Grove.
Lemon.
Lemon Grove.
That was my nickname as a child, Lemon.
Lemon? Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and I know you only because I know you as Pops because of Natalia.
A name that I absolutely hate.
Yeah. You hear that, Natalia? I'm never calling him Pops again.
I feel like a grandpa.
Yeah. All right. So give us who you are.
All right.
And what's your background and what is just your catchphrase of who you are and all that stuff.
Yeah. Born and raised in San Diego. Lived here my entire life, except for a few years where I either was away at college or was moved up to the Bay Area for about 5 years for work. But other than that, born and raised and love San Diego. Obviously huge changes here. Raised for a long time by a single mother with one sister and a couple stepbrothers and stepsisters eventually, and gained a lot of appreciation for single mothers and strong women through that experience. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about education, and part of it for me was reasons for becoming an educator was that I didn't really like school. I wasn't particularly successful at it, not because I didn't have the capability, but because I was bored and didn't see the relevance of a lot of it, particularly once I hit kind of middle school and high school. Why the hell am I ever going to need to use algebra?
Oh,
right?
God, you're speaking to me right now.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of just rote learning where the teacher would lecture or read, and I was just supposed to regurgitate that and repeat that. And I was bored out of my brain with that sort of learning. So I was a very average student. My mom was a middle school teacher and was all over my ass about making sure I was successful in school. So if my mom was on my ass, I got good grades. If she got distracted with other things of trying to work and raise kids and all that and wasn't on my ass as much, I completely slacked off and would just not do homework and just did that. I was interested in school because it was social. There were girls there. There were sports there. My friends were there. So that was my history in terms of school. Went into college thinking I wanted to be in college. In my family with my parents was not an option. It was going to happen for both my sister and I.
There was no if.
It was an expectation.
Right.
When I, was... and I wanted to go to college. And when I graduated from high school, last thing I wanted to do was go get a full-time job and support yourself, which was my parents' deal was, hey, if you don't go to college, you're on your own.
Go figure it out.
Yeah. And went into college thinking I wanted to be an architect and got to my first engineering class and very rapidly decided I did not want to be an architect. I wanted to draw a picture of a house.
Not learn all the instructional stuff.
Is it gonna stand up? I don't care about that.
I thought that's what all architects do, dude. That is my experience with architects. But anyways, go ahead.
Ended up into a junior college for a little bit, trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. Decided I wanted to, at the very least, wanted to be an English major. Writing was always a big part of my life. It's how I think. If I am working through something, either personally or professionally or whatever, I sit down and just write. It helps me think and organize my thoughts and figure out what I'm thinking and what I want to say. Pursued a degree in English, and eventually I chose to be, as I was getting ready to graduate from college, I was trying to say, all right, I'm going to graduate. And after that, again, my parents are like, we're going to pay for 4 years. And after that,
you're on your own.
Yeah. And I was like, what do I want to do? And I knew not necessarily that I had always wanted to be a teacher or anything like that. I really was thinking about, for me, I wanted to have a career. I wanted my work, the thing that I got paid for, to be something that made a positive difference in the world. That's really what it came down to.
That's nice.
And I thought about all kinds of ways of doing that. I thought about going to law school. I thought about a variety of different things. But it came down to really believing that education is a really powerful way to try and have a small part in shaping the future and sending better human beings out into the world and having that multiplier effect.
Yeah.
Some people go into education and teaching because they love their subject matter and they really just, they love chemistry and they really just want to impart that love to students. Then there are people that go into it because they love kids and that they, want to try and make a positive impact on kids. And that was really me, although I don't love little kids as much. So I chose high school.
Yeah. So you started teaching. How'd you get into teaching? What was your first job as a teacher, or what grade and all that?
To become a teacher, you get your bachelor's degree, and then you have to do your teaching credential. Yeah. So usually it's basically a first year of like graduate study. You spend a year doing your education in terms of how to be a teacher and practice student teaching, doing all that, and then you go out and hunt for a job. So my first job was I went to one teaching interview. It was the only job I ever applied for. And I went to an interview and got hired at San Diego High School in Encinitas back in the day when it was San Diego High School before it changed to San Diego High School Academy. I taught English and speech and debate and coached speech and debate and did that for 6 years at that high school. Then the school district, the San Diego Union High School District, opened up La Costa Canyon High School as a brand new high school and kind of split the population. And I moved out to La Costa Canyon, taught there for another 3 years. And the last year was split between being an assistant principal and a teacher. So I was doing both roles. And then I got my first administrative job, got hired at a middle school in the same school district, Oak Crest Middle School. And
what job as administrator? Like you were a principal or
assistant principal?
Okay.
Yeah. And I had never really had much interest in middle school, primarily because I didn't want to be a middle school teacher. Because you guys have been around middle schoolers, right?
Oh, it is. I actually had a contract to teach fitness for the after school program of Vista, and they were all middle school kids. And when I hear teachers now say how hard it is to teach middle school kids, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. Assistant principal of middle school. I got hired there and I was like, okay, I'll put in my 3 years at the middle school and then move back to the high school as an assistant principal as fast as I can. But I actually ended up really falling in love with middle school as an administrator. I would still not ever want to teach middle school because they're just a handful. They have so much energy and
they're going a lot of the beginning of their puberty. I think that's the big.
So that's my question for me. What was the change as far as administrative versus teaching in middle school? Where did you see that as far as being like, oh, I could actually do this? This is
in terms of middle school.
Yeah.
It was a couple of things. One, I really enjoyed the energy of those middle schoolers. They weren't as jaded. They still was okay to say, oh, I really like school and it's fun. And they interact with the adults probably a little bit more than a lot of high schoolers do. Administratively, the work was, so when you're a high school assistant principal, you are primarily dealing with attendance, discipline, supervising every single event that's on campus. So you're working 7:30, 8 in the morning till 8, 9 o'clock, some 10 o'clock, at least 4 or 5 days a week. And what made me want to be an administrator versus a teacher is the opportunity to really help more people and work with adults on how do we improve teaching and learning, How do we, do effective professional development? How do I support teachers? Not doing discipline, attendance, and supervising events all day, right? And there just is more time and space at the middle school level as an administrator to do that sort of work. And then I would also say, in general, and again, one of the caveats for our conversation today is we're going to speak in a lot of generalities, and there are obviously exceptions. My beliefs are shaped upon my experience, which is different than anybody else's experience with education. So, but in general, I would say middle school teachers are more focused on the kids, and high school teachers can tend to be more focused on their content. So what they teach versus who they teach.
Yeah. Huh.
And again, that's a huge generality, but in general, I would say that is the case.
Wow.
And even more, I would say elementary teachers are even more focused on the whole child and the kids versus content.
Yeah.
So it's
this whole child. This is like the third time I've heard the whole child concept, right? And it's like teaching to the children, which I think is very interesting because a lot of the kids, a lot of the teachers that we know, that's their number one, like their passion, right? And they teach elementary school. I don't think we have a whole lot of middle school teachers in our community right now that I know of. This concept of teaching the whole child is very interesting to me because I feel like that's where the topic of education, as we talk about it, it turns into, I got to deal with the curriculum and I got to do this and I got to do that. I'm hearing a lot of noise that doesn't pertain to the children, that affect the children, but it don't pertain to the children.
Right.
Yeah. So how does an administrator affect that in regards to dealing with teachers? Because you're dealing more so with teachers than you are with students, right? Especially at a principal level.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
Okay.
And one of my fears moving from teaching into administration was that I was going to lose that connection with kids.
Right.
And as a site administrator, regardless of whether I was a principal or an assistant principal, I never felt like I lost connection with kids. And I was very intentional about that. I really made sure I worked hard to maintain a relationship with kids. And as assistant principal, you're dealing with discipline. And you have what we call frequent flyers, the kids who spend more time than the most others in your assistant principal's office.
That was me.
And I always approached it as a disciplinarian. I approached it as a teacher, that my job was to work with these kids who are having trouble fitting within the process and the boundaries of schools. I approached it as my job was to teach them how to be successful interacting with a teacher they may not like, interacting with other kids with whom they have conflicts and dealing with it in appropriate ways, not as a hammer to just beat the crap out of a kid or, oh, you're getting suspended again and you're going to detention. And it was about making a connection between choices they make, behaviors, appropriate behaviors, coaching them on how they should do things differently the next time, giving them feedback on that. And so I always approached it, I was teaching, right? But instead of teaching writing or literature, I was teaching them how to navigate relationships and understand the concept of responsibility and accountability and teaching them life skills, honestly.
Yeah.
So that was...
So I'm gonna ask probably a weird random question, and I
love those.
Yeah, more or less because I grew up in so my hometown in Illinois, Princeville, is only 1,400 people.
Yeah.
I went to high school that was only 200 people. I went to middle school that only had probably 150 kids, maybe at that time. And you talk about assistant principal versus regular principal. So we never really had that. So it was like the principal had administrator. So for people that are listening that maybe have grown up in that scenario, kind of explain the difference between assistant principal or vice principal versus regular principal. I look at it as more like in a retail setting, right, where it's a manager versus assistant manager in a sense.
Yeah. So I think the traditional roles historically for those positions have been, so the term principal in the educational setting comes from, they used to be called principal teacher. And that means that they were the lead teacher of the school.
Oh.
That's where principal originally came from historically.
Wow.
Oh, wow, I did not.
Not necessarily as being in charge of managing the school.
Got it.
It evolved over time, and I think in many ways some of the administrative roles became more bureaucratic than being teacher leader. And I think as that evolved, principal still maintained some of those teacher leader, or should have, in setting a vision for the school, working to collaborate around setting a vision and working to lead others to achieve that vision. And assistant principals became more sort of the managers of the school. They dealt with facilities, they dealt with athletics, they dealt with activities, and they managed the school so that the principal would have time to be that teacher leader. Some were more effective in that than others. I think the more modern model, there's much more shared leadership and an expectation that all of the administrators will be teacher leaders first and foremost. It really depends on the level of support and the structures, and it varies really widely district to district and school to school.
Wow.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's what's been really cool with me having these conversations with, the teachers that we've had on or administrators that we've had on, that we're going at it. We're talking to people that have been in that larger school system.
Yeah.
Where it's thousands of kids or hundreds of kids. And there's so many of those schools that are so small, like mine, that a lot of this stuff, we talk about the way that they're taught, content versus, caring for the students and all that stuff and how that goes. And that, it still works that way in the small schools. But I did have a lot of teachers growing up in high school that did flow into the taking care of the student as well, which is great that we had that. But I totally see how that content versus nurture on the student side affects it. But
and I think that has evolved. I think there is more emphasis even at the high school level now of looking more holistically at kids, as opposed to just my job is to teach history and everything else is not my responsibility.
And do you think that's because of the way the society has driven the thought process, right? Like we talk about Gen X versus Gen Z, right? And then our baby boomers versus Gen X, so the mentality of society and culture, it was this over here on the one side of the spectrum. Now it's a little bit more of, you have to factor in ADHD and
learning disabilities, behavioral things, social economical issues. Yeah. I mean, just on and on. You and I talked about this briefly. We were at the Pizza Port thing, and I said, we talked about the concept of curriculum and how teachers are teaching now. And to piggyback off of what he's saying, we've talked about how kids are being taught now. And we've interviewed a couple of teachers now, a few teachers, and there was a different response across the board from every one of them. For the most part, the teachers that we've interviewed have all been passionate about teaching the whole child and taking the curriculum and being like, I'm going to make it my own. And then when you had said something to me at Pizza Port, when you said, hey, look, when should we be teaching certain things? And then I said, they were talking about how we taught education and the parents' role in the educational system and all that other stuff. And then you said, should we even be teaching things like sex ed or things like that? And talk to us a little about that. You were, as a principal, you were administrative and you were teaching. I wrote that down. Principals are teacher leaders. I love that. And so you played that role at the middle school level as well as the high school level, correct?
Correct.
Right. And then what was the biggest way you supported your teachers to make sure you were leading them?
Right. So I want to back up. We never finished my Tinder profile. we got a little distracted there.
Don't worry, buddy. He's not being picked on. He's not going to be picked up right now. All right, well, go ahead.
So I'll do that very quickly. Was a middle school assistant principal, middle school principal back at San Diego, where I started my first day as a teacher, and then executive director of curriculum instruction and assessment at the school district level then became assistant superintendent of educational services, and then became a superintendent. And then that was my last role. I retired as a superintendent. That's the curriculum vitae, as they say.
So you to say the least, you've touched every level
right.
of education.
Yeah, I spent 34 years doing that. So, yeah. And then I want to comment on what you were talking about, whether we should or shouldn't be teaching certain things.
Right.
The biggest, I think, one of the biggest changes I've seen in education in my time in the career was the expansion of what was expected of schools in our social kind of in our society. Ooh. And it has been ever broadening. And so you think of any social issue or any social ill, and schools now are expected to play some role in mitigating or solving it. You think about obesity. Now we're responsible for serving healthy meals, doing food and nutrition education, financial literacy, which back in the day, that's what our mom and dads taught us.
How to balance checkbook.
Now, financial literacy, sex ed, gender identity, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, any issue you think about. Poverty, how do we support kids who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds and additional services? I really believe schools, which used to be academic education institutions, are now social welfare institutions or social service. I would say social services, social welfare takes on a different connotation, but I really see them as social service hubs. And that is now the expectation of schools through legislation. And we're talking specifically California, but it is a national trend. Huge emphasis over the last 5 years around social emotional health and learning and wellness. California actually got rid of what used to be a county mental health service to provide services for juveniles, kids and juveniles. They scrapped it. And all of that is now integrated into schools. It is a huge expansion of scope. And at the same time, we've kept the same number of school days and the same number of school hours, but we're expected to do 10 times more than was ever expected in the past. And the level of funding increases have not been commensurate with the expansion of scope. So, and the expectation of all kids learning versus we teach if they learn and they don't if they don't, that mindset is gone. Now you are expected to teach every kid at a high level, and those kids not just teach them, they're expected to learn at a high level, and you're held accountable for that, which I absolutely believe in. I don't believe in this model. We teach if they learn. I taught it. They didn't learn it. So the academic expectations have increased. The breadth of things outside of a traditional academic education have expanded to all of these different areas, which again, I believe schools can and should play a role, but doing that within the same amount of time and with limited resources is setting schools up for failure.
I think, gosh, man, you just blew my mind right now by telling me the scope. I think you're spot on. And I go back to the comment you made at Pizza Port when we were at that event. I think there's certain things that from a socio-economical, I'm that kid that came from the poverty, socio-economic. And Jeff came from a small town, right? And he had both of his parents. And so there's a lot more, I don't know, would you say we get more attention at that level? In your environment growing up? Yeah,
but it's also different because we had such a small school that I wasn't stuck in this hundreds of kids in any given class. Like my class size was like 15.
Wow.
Right. So it's hard for me to be compared to that.
Right.
Just because of the small amount of students that we had in a certain situation where you were probably in a larger school with a lot more kids, and you get lost in that situation.
That was this is why I'm bringing it up, is because in that small school environment, you had a little bit more attention, if you will.
There was a little bit more like
nurturing. Yeah. Sure. And so you get into my environment, dude. Like, I think it was like something crazy. Like, I want to say it was like 30 or 40% of our entire class reached their high school diploma. Think about that, dude. So out of 300-400 kids or 1,000, whatever the number was, 40% of them graduated. I mean, that class size was so small. And only because, to which you just blew my mind about, was that when social work and the lack of social support for kids that come from a social economical background that's poverty or below, or addiction or abuse, that shouldn't be addressed in the school, in my opinion. I think, yes, you do have to deal with it at some point, right? But unless the school has the resources, I think the bigger the school system is and the more they have to cover in their umbrella, it just leaves room for dysfunction or kids falling through the crack, right? We're looking at it, and I don't want to get political, but even from our government perspective, like, the more the government controls, the crazier it gets, and the more restrictions. And how do you, because it gets to a point where you have so many problems underneath this umbrella that you just created that's huge, from social work. Now you're talking about social work.
Absolutely.
Right? And you got a kid who's throwing a chair at a teacher. That's not normal. He's probably been abused, or something happened to him, or something like that, versus leaning into the teacher doing what they're supposed to be doing and teaching them the things that they should be learning. And for the other 34 kids in that 35-person class, that sucks. That freaking sucks that the teacher has to go through that. And I'm that kid. I'm the one kid or the two kids that are like out of control because I needed additional nurturing to be able to go, dude, I'm not ready to learn 1 + 1 yet, dude. My head's not even there. I just buried somebody, or I was just abused at home. Like, I can't do that. I'm not even there yet. So why not remove that kid from that environment and then teach them, like, at their own pace, which requires resources, like you just said.
The sort of, I guess, counterpoint is, if we're truly committed to not just saying the job of the school is purely to teach academics, right, and to teach the whole child,
right,
then you have to be able to provide those services, right? And key is time and resources to do that, and appropriate training and appropriate staff. Because if I am your typical teacher, goes through, again, for middle school and high school, they studied an academic major of some sort, history, physical education, English, whatever. They get a teaching credential that focuses on how do you appropriately instruct those academic areas. You never get a shred of training about mental health, food and nutrition, and all of a sudden you're expected to teach that. You're a middle school science teacher. You're going to teach sex ed.
I think that was.
That's wait a minute. Wait.
Your major was marine biology, but now you're teaching sex ed.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the questions I think I have from an education, teaching college kids or kids to be teachers, right? And I don't know if you know this or not, but how does the curriculum change within the university aspect of it? If any, maybe veered some people over into that section where it's, hey, listen, this is the way that it's going, or it has
this is
gone.
the direction of this profession, right?
Like you said, you're a science teacher that's now teaching sex ed, right? So how do you even change the curriculum, or even like veer the curriculum to that to help out?
And I think so. I would say education, both at the university level and the institution of public K through 12, or TK through 12 now, education in the United States, change very slowly and do not do well with keeping up with the rapidity of change in our society, which is increasingly, incrementally faster the changes in our society. And the school system, K through 12, as well as the university system, doesn't adapt and pivot as rapidly as the rest. So I think that's part of the challenge. I think there are some programs, it's still a rarity. The typical track is you do your traditional undergrad major, regardless of whether let's say you study biology, right? You get your bachelor's in biology, regardless of whether you're planning on going on and getting your PhD in biology or whether you're planning on becoming a high school teacher, you're taking the same major with nothing in there about how to teach biology, which if you're going to get your PhD and want to go be a research scientist, you don't need that. But there are now universities where they have a biology major for teachers. And so it's a 4-year degree where they integrate into the curriculum throughout the 4 years, not just here's the biology, but here's the biology. And let's also talk about how you might teach this concept or this content to your to kids in the future. So it's an integrated approach to future educators. I think that's a better way of doing it. I would say it's definitely a minority of universities that have that. It's typically very large universities because a very small university might have 15 students that are looking to become future biology teachers. There are adaptations occurring, and sometimes that will integrate the teaching credential, which typically is a 5th-year program, into a 4-year program, and you graduate with both your bachelor's degree and your teaching credential. So it really comes down to school districts and schools needing to provide that level of professional development and support post hiring.
Right. Based on that, is there, what kind of post hiring education is there, or secondary
continuous learning?
Thank you. Continued learning for these teachers as they get hired, right? Has anything been started to be put into place for that with some of these schools?
At the district level, right? Or are you talking,
I mean, my doctoral dissertation was about teacher learning and professional development. So that's always been a passion for me as to why I became an administrator and the various roles I chose as I moved through my career. And what all of the research shows, traditional professional development in schools and in the world of education has been what's called a sort of pull-out one-time session. So you go, you have some person who's a supposed expert who comes and talks to you about what you should be doing as a teacher, might have a little bit of interactive activity, and you do that for a day or 2 days or whatever, and then you go back to the classroom and you're supposed to apply it. All of the research shows that does not work at all. Very rarely does it actually change teachers' practice in the classroom. What the research shows is that it has to be collaborative, not expert-driven, someone telling you what you should do, that it has to be collaborative with teachers working with other teachers to problem solve, to identify a particular problem with kids learning or a new thing that they're going to teach, collaborating around that, coming up with their best ideas, implementing those ideas, having time to come back together and say, how did it go? Let's look at the evidence. Did the kids learn it? And then revising their lessons, implementing it again. So basically the scientific process of, coming up with a hypothesis. Here's what we believe is going to happen.
Going applying it.
Looking at the evidence, adapting, reapplying. And you learn not just how to teach that specific concept, but then you learn, okay, why did students learn this? Why did they not? And you begin to apply that across all of your instruction. And so when it needs to be collaborative, it needs to be problem focused, it needs to be job embedded, meaning that you're not being pulled out of your classroom,
out of the environment that you're actually...
Or expected to do it during your vacation time or hourly at the end of the school day. It's job embedded. It is a regular process that happens, which is why you're seeing a lot of schools moving towards once a week early release time, where kids go home at noon or they start and that is the time that sort of collaborative activity ongoing on a regular and frequent basis, very focused.
What do they call that? Laura talked about this in her episode when we talked about, she had mentor groups early days, as you're mentioning this. And so she talked highly about this environment of collaborative and having mentors, other teachers that are mentors to her, that they take their half day and they meet as teachers. Yep. And what was that called?
Professional learning communities.
Yes.
PLC.
Or professional development. Right. And so I think that is so key. I'm getting flashbacks of like, when I had to learn lean in manufacturing and all this other stuff, it was like, you gave me flashbacks because that was exactly the feedback they gave to us. Toyota came up with lean, right? Toyota talked about small improvements for the better. And so you literally take an existing process and you make a tweak, you bring it back. You have your hypothesis. What's my issue? Here's the issue. Cuddle up with your peers or your support group. And you say, okay, here's what we can do. And you have all the support group from all different levels of the system that you're working in. And they go, okay, if you change this, it's going to affect me downstream. And then so they would go back and they're like, let's try this and see how it works. And then you go apply it, go back, meet again. And so I think that is how you change the direction of a very large ship.
And that is an incremental, it's a focus on continuous improvement. Right. And it's not an expectation that things are going to revolutionarily change overnight. Right. It is about, and I always believed this, and that it is our obligation as teachers, principals, educators, our obligation, and I believe it's an ethical obligation as part of the job, is to improve our practice. Because we owe the absolute best to our kids.
Absolutely.
We're not always going to give them the best, right? Everybody has a bad day. Sometimes you screw up as a teacher, but that's part of the learning process. But being committed to this concept of, I am going to change my practice and try to improve my practice every day, all the time, think about, reflect, change, because we owe that to our kids.
Right.
We owe them the best.
Yeah. But I think the educational system's so big right now. There is no, like, I made a statement. I was like, I take it back now, but it's because I didn't have a conversation like this where somebody from a high level administrator in the school system, I was like, I almost feel like the school system just needs to implode and start all over again and look at society as where it's at and to just rebuild it from the bottom up and just go. But there's some good that's happening for it, because I made the statement to you, is school for everybody? And the answer was no, it's not. And so it's really hard for me to accept that, right? And because in my fitness community, I think I have fitness for everybody. Realistically, not everybody's going to come to me, right? And not everybody's going to enjoy my brand of fitness. But that's the same applies when it comes to the educational system. The educational system's built, I feel like, linear. I did not know about the social, economical, like broadening of the scope. But even that, more of a reason why it shouldn't be that big, because now it's so big that you have to take the lean approach, right? The continuous improvement approach. You can't sit there and go, okay, how do we address this? And it's almost like it needs to be, changed for the better. I guess small improvements for the better. But in the grand scheme of things, is that good enough?
Yeah. So I want to talk about two things based on that conversation that we had. So our concept of public education was founded during a period of time, and for at least a couple hundred years, while we were an agrarian society. The industry in our country when public education was founded was agriculture.
Yeah.
So in fact, very few students even completed elementary school. And because there just honestly was not a need.
There were field workers
and the basic education was about some basic literacy and some basic, because the founders of our country believed that we should have informed, if we're going to be a democracy where people get to vote, some people got to vote at that point. And so again, think about who was educated. It was the more affluent white population at that point.
Wow.
And it was so that they could...
White privilege, bro. But go ahead.
No,
go ahead. Well, you go ahead.
Yeah, that's a controversial term, but
it gets stated here a lot.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Just go with it. Yeah.
And look, I'm about as white privilege as it gets, right? And I believe that there is such a thing as white privilege, and I believe I benefited from it.
Yeah, but anyways, good.
Anyways, so it was an agrarian society. It was public school, as it was known at that time, wasn't intended for everybody. Okay. And it wasn't built to educate everybody. That just wasn't the purpose of it.
Wow.
Then our society evolved, our economy evolved to become a more industrial economy. And so the needs of industry changed. They needed people who had some basic literacy. They could read a manual. They could do some basic things, but mostly they could follow some rote routines, working in a factory, doing the same thing, some basic thing. Okay, we got this new machine. We want you to read this manual, understand some basic things. We'll do a little bit of training, and then you're going to do the same thing over and over again for a decade. So it required more people shifting away from the agrarian. So there were less opportunities for employment in the agrarian, more economic opportunities in the industrial age. So schools expanded because they needed to educate more people in a different way. So that evolution within public education took place, and we were in the industrial age educational model. But again, it wasn't intended to provide a high-level education for all. People with disabilities, still in some up until the 1950s into the 60s, segregated education, two very different kinds of systems and quality. And it was designed to sort students. These students don't have the aptitude to go to college, so we're going to push them into the industrial vocational education. Wow. These students go on a track for university. Those are the elites, primarily white males. And so we had a 2-track system. I would say 3-track. Those who don't get an education at all. Those who get a vocational education because they don't have the aptitude based upon tests, rote learning, academic, and those that are academic and are headed towards the university. So we had that system. And then with the broach of internet, everything else, we became an information aged economy where industrial jobs were being exported overseas. So there's less opportunity for employment. Agrarian, because of mechanization of farms, large farming, all of that, those opportunities are very slim. Industrial is becoming increasingly slim. And it is now about, you don't need information anymore. The job of the school used to be to provide basic information, knowledge, right? Not a lot of skills, knowledge. And now knowledge is right here in this thing.
Yeah.
I don't need to know memorize the capital of the 50 states anymore.
Yep.
I don't, because I can get virtually any information I want like that.
Yeah.
So it now becomes, how do we discern good information, bad information? How do we think critically? How do we do all of these different things? So the system, that was the most radical change in the history of our society in terms of our employment market, all of those things. And there's no longer places. The old systems worked because there were jobs for everyone to go into, regardless of your level of education. You could work on a farm, you could go into industry, you could do all of these things. Most of those things are gone now. And so in an information age economy, you require a higher level of education to be competitive, to be able to employ yourself and be self-sufficient. And so that's a massive shift, because now the expectation is all students will get a high quality education and be able to learn at a high level. All students.
Good Lord.
And that's a massive shift for which our schools were not founded and have not been built over hundreds of years. And and that information age, the rapidity of change is bam, bam, right?
It's
you think
fast.
about evolution.
AI, all these things, right?
Yeah. And schools have not adapted. And on top of that, all of the other things that we just talked about in terms of the increased expectations outside of academics on schools. So that is a shift that education as a whole continues to struggle with, I think.
One of the last questions I wanted to ask you was like, the school system is what it is today, right? And it is pivoted. And there's so many, you talked about so many things that were implemented response to the way it's growing or to the way it's shifting.
Yep.
And those are all great. If there were no limitations to what was capable, you had all the funds, all the resources, and everything that you could possibly ask for or want, what do you think the school system would look like today? And how would you make it?
These ideas wouldn't be
popular. Yeah.
I think we need to have longer school days. I think we need to have longer school years because there simply is not enough time. And all the research shows if you give kids a 3-month break, the learning loss that happens in that 3-month break is, and that the school structure, the typical school calendar in our country was built around harvest time for farms.
Yeah.
Right. And that's gone. It makes no sense. Rethinking the time and space in which we have the kids is one huge structural thing. I think we have to change the concept, and this is something that is currently happening, but the traditional model was, I'm a teacher, I go into my classroom, I close my door, I do what I do with my kids, end of the school day, I go home. I taught, they learn, theoretically. I taught, they didn't learn, that's their fault, not mine. Okay, so that fundamental sort of cultural shift from an isolationist model where I'm responsible for my kids to a collective model of we are all responsible for the learning of all of our kids and we need to collaborate and work together, and we have to change the structure of the school day to provide embedded time for teachers to develop their own practice on an ongoing, every week, every month, every year, over and over, and just develop that collective practice that we're all responsible for all kids, not just you for yours and you go into your classroom, close your door and do whatever the hell you want. I think that's a huge cultural and structural shift that has to occur. This one is not going to be popular among some people. I think, especially in the state of California, in this very state to state in our country, I think we have to change job protections for teachers, tenure. The way our system is set up as a principal, I have a year and a half when I hire a teacher to determine whether they are going to get tenure. A year and a half. So you take a 22, 23-year-old brand new teacher, they come in, they teach for me for a year. I make a decision as to whether they're going to return for year 2. If I bring them back in year 2, I have from the beginning of school in August, essentially until January, to make a decision as to whether they're going to come back. If they come back, they get tenure. A lot of people are like, oh, once they get tenure, you can't do anything. That's not true. You can. I've done it on multiple occasions, but it takes an enormous amount of time. And if the teacher is mediocre, you're probably not going to be able to get rid of them if they really want to fight it. And it can go to court battles. It is incredibly expensive for school districts. So you have to hire lawyers and go through all this. It takes an enormous amount of time from an administrator's perspective. When I have gone through that process, I was in a particular teacher who I felt was really struggling. And the initial approach is, how do I help you to improve? And if I'm doing everything I can to help you improve and you're still not improving, primarily because of attitude and not wanting to change their practice or being resentful of me asking them to change their practice, and they're not improving, then the kind of my process switches from being trying to support you in learning to
how do I get you out?
Yep. And that requires being in the classroom 2 to 3 times a week, meeting with them every single time after that. And it consumes an enormous amount of time of one individual administrator for one individual teacher. And you can do it. And it's easy if they're doing really stupid things that are easy to document. But if they're hovering that line of there is no standardized definition of teacher malpractice, if you will. There's some very clear things like, okay, you do something inappropriate with a student, but the level of legal job protection they have makes it very difficult. And some teachers know that, and they know that they have that level of protection, and then they don't have that natural reflection and desire to improve.
Yeah.
And they can skate along and be very mediocre for an entire career. Some of that falls squarely, and I would say a lot of it, on administrators who, say again, at the high school level, so many demands upon them that honestly evaluation and support is a low priority for them of employees. I personally believe it should be your top priority. Supervising a basketball game should be at the bottom of that priority list, but the demands make it very difficult to do that. It was something I really focused on as an assistant principal and principal. It was something I absolutely expected of my assistant principals. And if they weren't doing that, administrators don't have protections. You are an at-will employee, can be fired at any time they want, or I want. And I was pretty ruthless with my assistant principals, and my reputation as an evaluator of teachers was that I held very high expectations, but also offered a ton of feedback and support.
Yeah.
And if I was doing that, and I was pretty ruthless with whether teachers got tenure. They had to be a superstar, or I believe they were a future superstar, because as ruthless and cold-hearted as it sounds, is if I had any fear that you were going to be mediocre, I believed I could go out and find somebody better.
Yeah, I think that is a great way to wrap it up. But I did not know how protected teachers were. And I think you get somebody who doesn't have a fear of loss. Like, you think about just in society in itself, if you do something illegal, you're going to go to prison, right? If you do something bad in your job, you're going to get fired. I could not imagine as a business owner, having somebody on my team going, I can't, it's literally impossible or so hard to discipline or address this issue. I love that feedback, although we do have teachers that probably are not going to find that to be popular. However, I think it's key that people have, for lack of better words, a fear of God that, hey.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I don't think that teachers should have no job protection.
Correct.
It can be an incredibly political
Correct.
environment when you have a pissed off parent and a weak administrator who won't stand up. Yeah, it should be about the quality of their practice.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we need to find ways to better support the quality of their practice, to have administrators do a better job of supporting, evaluating that process. Because I in my, I think, third year of teaching, I literally had an assistant principal who was my evaluator, who never once came into my classroom the entire year. And there's a deadline by which you have to get your evaluations done and, submitted and all that. And he chased me down. I was sitting in a van with 6 kids, getting ready to drive them to a debate tournament in the front parking lot of the school. And he comes running out, waving these papers, comes up to my window, and he goes, I need you to sign your evaluation. The dude had never been in my classroom. And I'm like, you want me to sign it without reading it? And he's, oh, you're fantastic. Everything's fantastic. And I was like, all right, whatever. I signed it. And
he checked the box.
And I resented that as a professional. I wanted someone to come and give me feedback. And I sought that out from colleagues who had similar mindsets, and I worked with them. But I taught for 10 years. I never got a piece of constructive feedback from an administrator.
Wow.
not once. You know, and it felt good. I got patted on the back, and I think I was a pretty good teacher, but I wasn't perfect. I should have gotten that. I was owed that, and I never got it, which was why when I became an administrator, it was a huge focus for me. But that was also a shock to most of the teachers when I would give constructive
because they weren't used to it.
They would, they'd get like deeply offended, yell, refuse to sign the evaluation. And I'm like, look, I'm not saying you're a bad teacher. I'm trying to help you improve.
Yeah.
And
criticism's hard to receive.
Yeah. But that's a culture that you create.
Correct.
You can create a culture where they don't see it as a threat. I'm not trying to fire you.
I'm just trying to identify and make it better.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to wrap this up.
Yeah, Mike, thank you very much for coming in.
Absolutely.
Dude, that was awesome.
Enjoyed the conversation.
I will say, that having teachers of all levels come in, and administrator now, like from an education perspective, it's been very quote unquote educational.
No pun intended, babe.
Pun intended.
Pun intended. Yeah. Pun intended.
That was just waiting. That was teed up for you, right?
Exactly.
You got to swing.
Anyway, Mike, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So much.
Enjoyed it.
This has been an international podcast transmission of No Fixed Agenda presented by Bubs Naturals. You can rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast episodes. NFA, over and out.